it's always been the privilege of the global North leaders to commit very little within closed rooms and to be able to pitch themselves as heroes outside. And they do it by leveraging rhetoric and optics to a degree which most leaders from global South were very often have found beyond their pale and beyond their capacities to do. So if they put commit -2 inside, a global North head of state can go out and say, I've actually committed +20 outside, and actually get it sold like a lemon to most global media as well as to us as global citizens. The developing country leaders, and this I'm talking of large emerging economies, perhaps of decent size, mid-size emerging economies of poor, lower income or middle income groups, they commit a little. They forget to talk about it in public most often. And when they do, they aren't able to sell it too well to either their audience or audiences outside. With that context, this year to me was rather odd as far as India is concerned. We went in, and by when I say we, I mean our government went in, the set of negotiators led by the Prime Minister in the first couple of days, and committed what seemed like a huge metaphoric change to the conversation. Within 6 hours of him having committed out, less in fact, I would say a couple of hours of him having committed that, when you began to look at the shell of what had been committed and what lay inside that shell, it became rather clear to everyone that there is a disconsonance in what's been committed. There's a lack of clarity which is glaring and hopefully not embarrassing, though I fear it might even turn embarrassing in coming days. And I'll come to why. What we came out eventually as India out of the COP26, I would think, was just by a real thin slice of skin survive what might have been a rather difficult eventuality coming out of COP26. And Meenakshi and Gagan talk about it, about the debate between coal being asked to be either phased out or phased down over a short or midterm period. And I'll come to that last. And I'll present this all in a fashion of looking at it in terms of where our economy stands at the moment, what challenges it faces, and what economic challenges may arise or we may need to deal with as we now undergo this transition that the Indian government has committed India to. Now, let me look at the targets and reread them. Gagan did, but I'll go through them again because to me they sound peculiar and how they're presented. Obviously, there's this 500 gigawatt non-fossil energy capacity by 2030 that we commit. We commit to 50% of India's energy requirements coming from renewable energy by 2030. And let me stop here and pause here perhaps. Now, this is the exact readout of the Prime Minister's statement. Must remember that we have not formally so far provided updated NDC or nationally determined contribution, as it's called, to the UN ever since. And one of the reasons may lie in this. We committed to 50% of India's energy requirements coming from renewable energy by 2030. Now, as most of you would know, energy is not equatable to power. Energy includes all the oil we consume and 60 or 70% of Indian households that also burn biomass, fuel wood of different kinds to keep their kitchens running and the fires burning to provide food, the minimal amounts that we are able to provide to our families. We also committed to a 1 billion reduction in carbon emissions, 1 billion ton reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. We also, as Gagan again pointed out, committed to what is easily feasible if we go by Government of India measures so far of achieving carbon intensity of less than 45% of GDP I think is what's not said but meant by 2030. And last of all, the long-term 2070 target of net zero. Now, while I think citizens at large and those who engage with conversations on climate change and energy back home in India very often debate and talk about where do these numbers come from, does government consult everyone, etc. I still tend to side on the point of saying maybe it's not possible to do these top-down calculations in a very argumentative manner. At the end of the day, if you look at these 5 targets that Indian government has provided, at least orally the Prime Minister has provided, none of them sit with each other and reconcile with each other. If you look at just a set of 2030 targets, if one was to put them together, I have not seen one study, one assessment, either by the government of India or somebody outside, much closely aligned with the government of India, which suggests that all 4 of them, those 2030 targets, reconcile. Particularly if you imagine us committing that in next 10 years or so, 9 years or so, 50% of our entire energy requirements will come from renewable energy forms. Now, most of us have been trained to quietly correct for the government of India what it does not correct itself. So we've been trained or told to quietly turn the phrase in renewable energy into a capacity and energy requirements into capacity requirements instead, power capacity requirements. But the fact is we provide these numbers orally, and there is at the moment no fair assessment or modeling done in public domain that the government of India endorses to suggest how it reached these numbers. To my mind, and I think fairly to most people who've seen these numbers as with a critical eye, they are doubtful. Some too easily achievable, some impossible to achieve by 2030, and the others really, really tough to achieve. Now, if they were all in one realm, one could still reconcile and be fine with it, but they aren't. What these numbers must be seen, I think, in terms of where our economy stands today and what the trade-offs are. Very often, when we look at financing the transition, we only look at finance coming in one direction. We do not, as economists, it's better to review and say, is the finance being diverted away from where it would have gone otherwise? And would the resources of state be diverted from other priorities to invest into this for good or for bad reasons? And to that, one must consider that the last 2 years, the Indian economy has taken a shake like it hasn't before. Not that we were doing very well when we went into the pandemic, but we today stand in gross terms exactly where we did 2 years ago with the total GDP of the country. Our taxation system before that has shaken the medium and the small enterprises out of their heads. It's suffered the kind of hits that I don't think any economy has seen for a while since post 1991, maybe during recession once, in global recession once. We've also seen the kind of unemployment levels that we haven't seen in a long, long while. I wouldn't want to put the numbers on the decades on that, but clearly all records show the levels of unemployment are extremely high. The number of people looking for employment has gone down substantially. And that suggests to us the mood in the society about what might be available and how much difficulty people are facing at this stage. Now, even if we were to chug along at the growth rates that numbers suggest, we would recover in the longest run or the mid run out of this rut. What that would leave the economy with, we are beginning to see early stages of. Instead of a fiscal boost where we've seen a credit boost to the system, we've seen the inequity in our economic systems increase and tend to increase quite dramatically in the last couple of years. The change of how the fiscal pressures are being provided for recovery. Gagan mentioned this and mentioned this rather politely. Being a journalist, I have the license to say it rather harshly, I think. So very often I'll be repeating Gagan on these counts. You remember that when this government came in, it brought in a scheme called Uday, which was trying to wipe out the debt that the electricity distribution companies were facing, palm it off to the state governments, and basically do an accounting trick where it is put on the state exchequer's balance sheet rather than the distributor's balance sheet, and allow them to restart afresh as if they didn't have enough redness in their books. 5 years hence, we are back to a much worse situation where we started from. And if you look back, this is not the first time the governments have tried to do this with the distribution companies. It's been happening since the UPA era. In real terms, what we're doing really is, because we've created an atmosphere where we cannot acknowledge that many of our citizens cannot pay for power at the moment, what we ended up doing is accepting those as an accounting trick on the books of the distribution companies for 5 years, and then quietly cleaning it up by distributing that cost across society every 5 years through a scheme like Uday. Which really, to my mind, when we talk about 20% T&D losses, and these can range up to 34% in some cases, what we're really talking about is the lack of capacity in India today to pay for basic energy needs. In global terms, this is called energy poverty. We do not use those terms in India too often, but this is where we stand. Now, coming from that point to put the kind of investment and the kind of chaotic challenges that India will face when we transit so fast. And I think the goodness of heart in India is that none of us are climate skeptics, unlike in the Anglo-Saxon world. But we are trying to collectively discover the right pace at which we can go transiting towards a green world. And the fact is, at the moment, the government does not have too much ball bearings to figure out how fast we are rolling on these numbers, or will be able to roll or not. If you look at the previous NDC, the first NDC that Indian government gave, out of the 3 pillars of that NDC, the operational pillars, one has fallen apart pretty quickly in the first 3 years of providing that in 2015, the one on forestry itself, and forest becoming a sink for us. The fact is, those numbers, when committed, were wrong. They were committed on the basis of forest survey records, which are fudged once every 2 years, sometimes fudged going back as far as 10 years. And we use that as a reference line to make a commitment then. The government of India has been so ashamed of what it did at that point that it's thereafter never tried to speak about it in public domain, forget international arenas. My fear at this stage is that we made these commitments to make a political point, hopefully for the country, but definitely for the Prime Minister at a global stage. And therefore, we might have put ourselves in a little jeopardy. The jeopardy arising of, one, whether we can achieve these targets to begin with, whether 1 or 2 of them are really reasonable or just complete mistakes, that would be embarrassing. And 2, if you look at the gambit that has been playing, and Meena talked of it in much elaborate detail in the first round, of where we are going with this, it's clear to our minds, I think, that at least for large, low-income emerging economies such as India, the only set of finances that would be available would be from tapping markets when markets find it feasible to be tapped. There is not going to be public finance flows between nation states supporting these transitions in countries like India. Therefore, India would have to do almost entirely all of the weightlifting itself, aided by whatever market can provide at different times, depending on how much signals we give. And yet, the way the ball is rolled in the Conference of Parties this year, and since Paris, we're quite sure that we would be asked to review these targets upwards quite frequently. And there, I think India's made a bad call, and we do know that there were differences even between the government of India's different arms on how much we should commit and if we should commit at this stage at COP, this particular COP. India did decide pretty early on, few months before the COP, that it would go ahead with the 2070 target, even though it pretended otherwise outside. The fact is, we have now landed in a soup because we perhaps have overcommitted already. And we are walking into a regime where we will be constantly pushed to ratchet it up, or we would be shamed the way the attempts were made this time about the debate over coal phase down or phase out. At least my little experience in MENA here is much more. I've learned most of what I know from her and her team at Third World Network and people like them. Is the Conference of Parties, while it's the only place for developing countries to retain some semblance of democratic rights, of right to growth, is yet a place where geopolitics is played rather dirty. It's not a place for grandstanding, it's a place for very calculated moves by all nation states. And I think repeatedly, unfortunately, India has made these calls more based on one, grandstanding of the leaders, and two, based on geopolitical calls or larger economic calls or trade-offs being made elsewhere outside the climate change regime, and conversations about what we should give and what we will get in return. And looking at these numbers this year particularly, and I could say this in 2015 as well, and the evidence of the 2015 number, we've already seen the flux through which the renewable industry has gone through, even in the first shock of COVID and a year before that. These targets that we've committed this time, I fear, have presented us in a position which might have made the current government and its leader, the Prime Minister, look like a global leader. But these have been done without estimating the overall costs to the economy and the trade-off that would be required if we were to even try and achieve these numbers. And let me give a figure to this. I'm also part of something called the National Foundation for India, which from last year onwards began looking at the number of lives involved in coal and coal-consuming sectors across the country. And in our first phase, we looked at only direct and indirect jobs and not induced jobs, which are much larger, though the volume of money we still have to determine, but the number of lives involved would be much larger. And this is a secondary research, but it presented together through looking through labor force participation in different sectors. My colleagues, Kavya and Swati at NFI, just released that report, which referred to about 14 million people whose livelihoods are directly linked right now to coal and coal consuming industries. Now, most of them, unlike say in developed world, are in the unorganized sector and difficult to approach, with very low levels of skills and very often eking a really basic livelihood. Our work continues to look at induced economies of coal in the country and how that would matter. When we all agree that coal needs to be phased out, we must understand that there are costs of transitions which are borne unevenly by different segments of society. This is not the first time, perhaps, that we're making a transition based on a change in technology in a certain sector. But this is perhaps the most transformative, and this is far more induced by standards rather than the invention of different technologies and the pricing of the technologies coming down over time. And therefore, the impacts are going to be much different than that. In Europe or in the US, it's fair to talk about green jobs emerging, etc. But I think to all of us, it's very clear that in large, low-income emerging economies like India, the gainers would be a very different subset than the millions who would lose as this transition happens. And the capacity for the state to provide for them will be very minimal, considering we are still a country where we are unable to provide basic nutrition. We are a country where we are still unable to commit to basic power needs of the nation, basic energy needs of the nation. We are still a country where we do not safely play. We play safely by not committing even to basic right to drinking water for citizens at this stage. That here, the country will have to take on the additional challenge of providing this impulse either to market, to incentivize market to give us more funds, or provide these funds on our own pocket. And to do so, while the cost that we need to invest in adaptation will continue to rise in the next 50 years. And going by current standards, much of it will be borne from our own pockets. We are again a country which looks at social security schemes with fear right now and talks about undoing some of them because the burden of these social security schemes is pretty high on the exchequer. And we've seen that debate play out in the so-called farm laws, etc. Eventually, the government did have to retrieve it back, unwillingly perhaps. I think when we look at these transitions, and this is why these numbers, while they sound very nice and make it sound very good internationally, we must be very careful of how they will change the nature of our societies. There will clearly be a set of us who will do better by having green energy, having better lives. But this transition towards a clean, green, sustainable economy, as we call it at times, holds the potential of also being the double whammy for the most marginal in our country. The same set of people who unfortunately had to dig the earth under their own feet to pour coal out for us to consume more energy than they do, could now face the transition again and be left behind in this great global game, so to say. While their names as indigenous people, etc., is used too often at global forums, not just by us, but most often, ironically, by the global north, to make us do what perhaps is unfair upon us. I think we are at a stage where think tanks, research groups must essentially work to pin these numbers beyond the rhetorical use, to be more skeptical. I wouldn't say cynical, but clearly we need skepticism with the data that we're providing and the numbers we're committing. We've seen across the board in the last 6 to 7 years, economic data, social data, etc., that's been projected, put forth, has moved itself a distance too far from reality. It's too critical for us in India at this stage that the numbers, the data, and the commitments we make on climate change go too far away from our realities.